Good evening. I'm Terry Powell, and I'm the Community Relations Officer at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I'd like to welcome you here tonight for the Berkeley Lab Friends of Science-sponsored Science at the Theater event. I thank you for your interest in science and the research being done at the lab. And I'd also like to thank our many co-sponsors, including the University of California at Berkeley, Chabot Space and Science Center, the Exploratorium, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkeley, the Lawrence Hall of Science, and especially the science departments at Albany, Berkeley, and Oakland high schools. Our speaker today is Chris Somerville, the Director Designee for the about-to-be-launched Energy Biosciences Institute and a UC Professor of Plant and Microbial Biology. He has also been, for the past year, a visiting scientist in Berkeley Lab's Physical Biosciences Division. He has both a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and a PhD in Genetics from the University of Alberta, and did postdoctoral studies in biochemistry at the University of Illinois. For over 25 years at both Michigan State and Stanford, Chris Somerville has taught, directed research, and published extensively on various aspects of plant and microbial biochemistry and physiology. During the past decade, his research has been focused on the structure and functions of the cell wall. He has received numerous awards and honors, most recently in 2006, the prestigious International Belsen Prize for his work in plant molecular genetics. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society of London. Today, Chris Somerville is a leading authority on the structure and functions of the plant cell wall, which comprise most of the body mass of higher plants. As a strong public advocate of the potential of fuels derived from plant biomass, his experience and expertise defines the ideal match of his interest in the development of cellulosic and other solar-to-fuel science and technologies with his recent designation as director of the BP-funded Energy Biosciences Institute. With colleagues in biology, the physical sciences, engineering, environmental, and social sciences, he will lead the EBI multidisciplinary team's research efforts to develop next-generation carbon-neutral transportation fuels. He began his Berkeley affiliation in August 2006, eager to accept the challenge of reducing our carbon footprint by leading the investigations of converting plants to fuels, which is the subject of his talk today. Please welcome Chris Somerville.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to try and do tonight is provide an explanation of what's happening in biofuels and what we see as both the opportunities and the problems and the prospects for future developments. I'd like to begin with just an overview of how we currently obtain energy, as shown here. This is from the International Energy Agency. And what one can see looking at this part of the figure is that we get about 85% of our energy from oil, coal, and gas. Interestingly, that agency projects that in 2030, the pattern will be almost the same, although you can see from the size of the graph that energy use is expected to almost double by that time. So the first thing I think I want to point out from this is that people who are adding up how much fossil fuel is around don't expect us to run out anytime soon. So the issue about biofuels and alternative fuels is, of course, not about running out of fossil fuel. I think that from my perspective and what got me engaged in the opportunity was concern about climate change. And I don't really want to give a talk on climate change except to say it's graphs like this showing the projected increase in annual mean temperature, in this case from a study at the Hadley Center in England, showing quite a large change projected in global mean temperature during this century. And there are many things that one can say about and have been said about that change, and we have actually an expert here tonight. I think Jim Collins is here. But the part that I find most alarming about it is this piece of data, which shows changes in rainfall per millimeters per day. So you can see, for example, wherever it's red, they're projecting that in the period 2070 to 2100, they anticipate substantial decreases in rainfall. Those decreases in rainfall, if they were to happen, will dramatically affect the ability of people in many regions of the world. You can see even in Europe, Midwest, and particularly in the equatorial regions, to feed themselves. And that in turn will have huge political consequences, of course, and create enormous hardship. So I think that that's why we should be worried about climate change, well, one of many reasons. So the question is, in some way, what are the alternatives to business as usual with fossil fuel? And if we look at what the opportunities are for carbon-free energy, first let's begin with how much we use, which shown here, we use this is on a log scale, we use 13 terawatts of energy. What that means is that a terawatt is 10 to the 12 watts. So the instantaneous use, average use, is 13 times 10 to the 12 watts, or watt hours. Now I've colored that in a graded way because, of course, much of that energy use is currently not done efficiently. And I just want to mention that the National Lab has about 400 people working on energy efficiency because that is probably the big opportunity. And so there's no doubt we can shrink that, and we need to shrink that. On the other hand, because energy use is expanding very rapidly, I put this kind of funny icon in for nuclear because there's some discussion about, one sees applications for nuclear coming back after a long 25-year absence. But to put it in perspective, the rate at which energy use is expanding worldwide is the same amount of energy as a nuclear power plant can produce every 2 days. That means every 2 days, world energy use expands by 1 gigawatt, which is the size of an average nuclear power plant. So nuclear is certainly not the solution, although perhaps it's going to be part of the solution. If one looks at the other opportunities, you can see there's about 4 terawatts of wind available worldwide. Interestingly, there's about 12 terawatts of geothermal. That means pumping fluids into the mantle and then having them heated and brought back up to drive turbines or something. So there certainly are other options, and we certainly need to explore all these. But when you look at how much they could quantitatively contribute, this is the one that, of course, seems most interesting because we get about 8,000 times as much energy as all human energy uses from the sun each year. Now, when one says solar, inevitably people think of photovoltaics. And indeed, photovoltaics are a great technology, but it's been estimated that to meet US energy needs, we need about 26,000 square kilometers of photovoltaics. And the total shipped in the world between 1982 and 1998 was 3 square kilometers. So there's kind of there's a discrepancy between our ability to produce them and our need to use them. In fact, if we covered every roof in America with photovoltaics, that would provide 7% of our energy, which is something we should try to do, but it's by itself not going to be the solution. The other way of using solar directly is through plants. And the fundamental equation is shown here. The energy from sunlight is used by the photosynthetic apparatus to reduce atmospheric CO2 into polysaccharides. And when they're burned, either directly or indirectly, the heat released by combustion produces work, and the CO2 cycles around. So in principle, plants not only use sunlight, but they can produce carbon-neutral fuels because the CO2 released by combustion is refixed by photosynthesis. Now, to get a sense of what's really possible with photosynthesis, there's many ways to calculate it, but I think this is the simplest and most compelling. We get about 90,000 terawatts of energy from the sun rising at the surface of the Earth. About 71% of it falls on water, and so it's not really available to us currently in any way that I know of to capture it. If you then ask, well, how much of the land, of the solar that falls on land would we need if we could only get it at 1% efficiency? And it turns out 5% of the land would produce all human energy needs. Now, I don't think that we're going to get 5%. I'll come to that in a moment. But if we get even 1% at 1% efficiency, that would be all transportation fuels. So you ask, well, how much is 1%? Don't we need it all for other purposes? And the answer is probably not. That is, we use about 5% for cereal production, about 7% for other crops. About half is in forest savanna, you can see 30% pasture and range, and 35% is not arable. So one of the things that needs to be studied and that we intend to study here on a global basis during the next few years is to understand what's possible with land use. Just to give something that I find very fascinating, the FAO recently released a study pointing out that the emissions from cattle grown for meat actually are, in terms of their greenhouse potential, are equivalent to all transportation fuels. So certainly eating less meat would not only open up some land for other purposes, but would have a very useful effect on the climate. And I actually, when I talk to students these days, I've been trying to convey that I think some additional research on how to improve the quality of vegetarian products from soybeans would be interesting. Well, now I want to just briefly go to what are the types of biofuels. And of course, everyone is familiar with the solid type that can be burned directly. Otherwise, there's three types generally. There's sugar to ethanol from sugarcane, cellulose to ethanol that I'm mostly going to talk about, and diesel or biodiesel. So let's just look briefly. In this slide from World Watch, they've estimated what the productivity of different types of crops is for these products. And you can see that sugarcane, according to their estimate, produces about 6,000 liters of fuel per hectare. A hectare is 2.5 acres. Corn, by their estimate, and this is corn grain, produces about 3,000 liters. You can see over here on the oil side, palm will produce about 5,000 liters, oil palm per acre. Now, in this country, there's $1 a gallon subsidy for biodiesel from soybean, and I hope you can see that actually really doesn't make any sense at all. It's an awful use of the land. If we look briefly at Brazilian sugarcane, you can see that most of the sugarcane is grown down in that region of the country, actually far away from the Amazon. At the present, they expect to produce 8 million hectares of cane next year in 333 mills, and they're planning another 200. So this is expanding very rapidly. I met with a Brazilian delegation this week, and they have studied it and claim they can produce 40 million hectares of sugar from sugarcane. And as I'll come to in a moment, I actually think that's almost enough for all transportation fuels worldwide if we could use all the cane instead of just the sugar. So at present, the sugar is only 14% of the mass of the plant, so it's not very efficient. What's interesting about it in some way is that as a model for producing biofuels, they've sort of already dealt with one of the realities, which is that a lot of biomass has to go into those plants. So they deliver 1,500 truckloads of stuff per day. So it's a really massive kind of effort. In this country, biofuels generally means corn grain ethanol. So the basis of it is that a corn grain is about 65% starch, so all that region of the kernel. And this shows where in the US plants have sprung up during the last few years producing ethanol from that starch, and the remaining part of the seed is fed to cattle. So I think there's more than 100 in any event, producing about this year 7 billion gallons. So actually this year US will produce more than Brazil in ethanol. Now these plants are mostly owned by farmers' co-ops, and there's been much discussion of corn grain ethanol as to whether it's carbon positive or carbon neutral, energy positive or energy negative. But the reason that these plants have sprung up so rapidly is that they have been very profitable. And so at least until recently, farmers were, I spoke with a farmer group in which one of the farmers said that they had raised the $50 million required to build a plant in their neighborhood in 9 hours, just from the neighbors. And then they paid it off that year because it's been very profitable. Ethanol 4 years ago was selling for $1 a gallon, and 3 years ago it was selling for $3.50 a gallon, or 2 years ago it was selling for $3.50 a gallon. So it's been quite a boon to agriculture. In fact, farm subsidies went down $6 billion last year in the US because of the increased value of the corn resulting from this. I'll come back to whether it's a good idea later, and I just want to go through the possibilities. Biodiesel arises from the plant. Well, there's many ways to produce biodiesel. Of course, there's animal tallow and other sources of used fats. But in the context of making biodiesel from plants, people are thinking about it because in the seeds of plants, so this is an electron micrograph through a single cell of a seed of a plant, and all the sort of light areas are fat or oil, vegetable oil. So many plants will produce about 40% of the weight of the seed as lipid. And that can be produced or converted into a pretty good biodiesel. And indeed, biodiesel has been expanding very rapidly. This is caused in part by the fact that the European Union mandated, for environmental reasons, or theoretical environmental reasons, that the fuel supply should contain almost 5% biodiesel. Well, it turned out that that biodiesel was not available in Europe, and it led to massive exports of Malay or South Asian palm oil to Europe. And so, unfortunately, that was associated with a lot of deforestation, so that the net effect was actually negative environmentally. And I think it's a really good example of really bad policy and something that we would hope to avoid. So that is when you cut down one of these tropical forests, particularly if it's a swamp, much more greenhouse gas is released than you'll ever save by burning, or at least in the next 50 years, by burning biodiesel. Furthermore, in fact, biodiesel is a very bad idea in terms of meeting our national goals. This is a slide from the U.S. Congressional Research Office. So here's, U.S. uses about 60 billion gallons of diesel, about 140 billion gallons of other fuels. And if we converted every ounce of plant and animal fat in the U.S., all the butter, all the lard, all the vegetable oil, that's how much biodiesel we could make. So there's not much doubt that biodiesel is not going to be a major contributor to our nation's energy needs. There's actually now almost 100 biodiesel plants in the U.S. in operation, and you'd get the impression that it was a substantial activity, but when you add up their capacity, that's how much it is. It doesn't show above the line, because these are all little niche operations where someone has a couple of million pounds of leftover fat or something. And so, although it's a good use of the fat, it's just at the national level, it's not a solution to our problem. There is one other type of biodiesel that may be more promising, and that is many species of marine algae accumulate up to 85% of the mass of the cells as fat or lipids. And indeed, we have about 20 companies, little startup companies in the US now, exploring whether these algae can be grown on any commercial scale to produce them. This is a reactor on the roof of a building at MIT where actually they're trapping flue gases and passing it through the culture. The problem with this technology at the moment is the Department of Energy studied this for about 20 years at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and concluded it wasn't feasible because although there's a lot of sunlight, the energy density is only about 200 watts per square meter. And so if you think about that, the algae can fix the photons at about 10% efficiency maximum. So they're only getting about 20 watts per square meter maximum. So it's very difficult to build a device that will hold them with such a low energy density. So the solution to growing algae is probably going to involve some really cheap reflectors that can increase the density of light on the reactors, I think. Finally, I think it's a legitimate question, and in many other regions of the world, people are interested in how much fuel could one obtain from municipal solids. And I don't have time to go into this, except WorldWatch has done an analysis and concluded that a city with 1 million people could produce about 150 million liters a year of fuel, because much of the urban waste is cellulosic, and once we have technologies for that conversion, it will be a useful technology or a useful source of fuels. Interestingly, that 150 million liters is enough for 58,000 people in the US, 360,000 people in France, and they claim 2.5 million people in China, reflecting different patterns of energy use around the world. All right, well, I'd like to turn now to the cellulosic opportunity. So what I've tried to say up to now is that there's, although biofuels today currently mean sugar and starch, I think in the future it's going to mean cellulose. So in fact, we expect the corn grain ethanol in the US to level off at about 12 to 15 billion gallons a year. And the DOE, at least, is expecting that somewhere out here around 2015, cellulosic ethanol will begin to take off as a major contributor. One of the reasons this has become a popular idea, I suppose, in certain circles, is that the Department of Energy and the USDA did an analysis of the nation's capacity to produce cellulose that's excess to all our other needs. So a group of scientists went county by county, looking at land use, what was grown there, and what the productivity was, and compiled this chart. And what it shows in brief is, for example, that if we took half of the corn stover from the 90 million acres, roughly, that's being grown, we could get about 26 billion gallons of ethanol using some projection of the conversion efficiency. Similarly, there's quite a bit of wheat straw. There's some, here's urban waste and forest thinnings in this case. And in this case, they calculated that the set-aside lands, the 36 million acres that farmers are paid not to farm, if they were brought into production with a perennial grass like switchgrass, you could get 35% of 1.3 billion tons of biomass. Now, to convert that to fuels, the theoretical conversion efficiency for most cellulosics is around 100 gallons of fuel, let's call it ethanol, per dry ton. So that 1.3 billion dry tons would produce 130 billion gallons of ethanol under good conversion efficiency. That, as you may note from the numbers I gave you earlier, is similar in magnitude, at least, to the total total gasoline use. However, of course, ethanol only has about 2/3 of the energy density as gasoline. So realistically, if this were accomplished, it might produce half, roughly, or slightly more than half of the nation's needs. So the Energy Secretary has, in fact, placed a national goal of producing 30% of transportation fuels from cellulosics by 2030, largely on the basis of these kinds of estimates. And I think from first principles, it seems somewhat reasonable. However, I actually personally disagree with a lot of the ideas behind it. So, for example, if we just look at the corn stover, the question is, can that stover be removed? The stover is the stalks and the leaves of the corn plant. So at the moment, on the 90 million acres we're growing, only the cobs are taken. So if we were to take half of the stover, what happens to the productivity of the land? Well, a USDA scientist named Ken Vogel has been studying this for some years, and you can see that after a couple of years of removing only half of the stover, the productivity of the acres is going down. And this raises concern that removing the stover is not sustainable because presumably the stover, that is the stalks and things, have to be plowed back into the ground to support the microflora that mobilize nutrients in the soil. This is something actually we want to understand. What is really going on here? And today the tools such as the ability to sequence very large amounts of DNA will allow an analysis of what's happening to the soil microorganisms in these kinds of studies. So I and a number of other people in the field think that perhaps the future is not really going to be taking leftover agricultural residues, but rather dedicated energy crops that can be grown more sustainably than corn. Corn raises lots of issues, and I'll show you some data about it later, why corn is not necessarily the best thing for the land in any event. Now, beginning in the Carter era, Jimmy Carter's administration, of course, came at the end of the oil shock of the 70s, and his administration initiated a bunch of work on alternative energy sources. That led to studies of a large number of plant species as potential energy sources. The key thing, of course, with all these species is productivity, and for several reasons. One is kind of shown here. That is, if you ask how much land would it take to provide enough biomass for a 500,000 gallon a day plant, you can see that if you get 20 tons per acre, it's that much, but if you get 2 tons per acre, it's that much. And in general terms, for this kind of activity, it's desirable to minimize the amount of land being used. Additionally, the cost of producing fuels, the transportation cost looks something like this, so that if you're producing 20 tons per acre, the cost per ton of transporting it to a plant is low, whereas if you have low productivity per acre. The cost can be high because you're driving so far from the site of production to the site of utilization. So using really highly productive specialized plants is going to be essential if this makes any sense. This is a picture of a species called Miscanthus giganteus that's growing at the University of Illinois. It's been growing, this plot is 7 years old. It's been cut every year at ground level and the biomass removed, and it's never been fertilized or irrigated. And this plot is now yielding 26 tons a year of biomass, which is quite impressive because, of course, it spends about 3 months under the snow each year. Now it turns out on a annualized solar efficiency basis, that is photons to chemical storage, that's about almost 2% annualized yield. So remember I said if we could just get 1% on 1% of the land, that would be all transportation fuels. It's plants like this that make us think that that 1% is going to be possible. And in fact, after conversion of this to a fuel, it would only be 1% because we lose about half of the chemical energy, at least with current technology. Now, the reason this plant is so productive is shown here. There's several reasons, but one is that when it comes to an annual crop like corn, shown in blue, the farmers, of course, can't get out into the field until the fields dry up. And so actually quite a bit of the useful growing season is gone, and then the plant has to establish from a seed, whereas these perennials come up as soon as the snow blows off, and when you integrate under the curve, the annual photosynthetic yield is much higher for a highly productive perennial. Miscanthus has been studied for more than 10 years in Europe. There was the Europeans are interested in it as a bioenergy crop, and they funded a 17-site, 10-year study at the sites shown with all these little dots. So we actually know quite a bit about it from the European study, and it's one of the reasons that we're quite interested in it. It doesn't mean it's the only thing that is interested, but we're using it at the moment as somewhat of a model for an energy crop. And switchgrass is much talked about. It was talked about in the State of the Union address. This is switchgrass here growing beside a stand at the University of Illinois. And you can see that it's not as productive. And indeed, in quantitative studies, here's the switchgrass yield side by side with Miscanthus. So we pretty much favor Miscanthus over switchgrass. Now, having said that, there are issues with Miscanthus. This one is actually, the one I showed you is hand propagated from root cuttings. It's a sterile hybrid, and one of the scientific questions we have, or technical questions, is we have to figure out how to propagate the thing in order to really use it. There are seeded varieties, and we'll be exploring whether they can be grown. Additionally, I want to mention that I guess it'll be known to people here that traditional field agriculture uses monocultures. And the reason for that is that plant breeders have found it difficult to develop mixed or multiple genotypes that can mature and have the same height and that can be grown at the same time. It's a concept in plant breeding called multi-lines, the idea to put genetic diversity in a field. In contrast to traditional field crops, our expectation is that these dedicated bioenergy crops will be certainly mixed genotypes, that is, many genetic varieties, and possibly mixed species. There's many reasons, both theoretical and practical, to hope that we can make that work. And indeed, this slide from a recent science paper by David Tillman and colleagues, what it's showing is something that's following. See down here, number of species, and up here, in this case, CO2 sequestration. So you can see as the number of species in a plot increases, the amount of carbon sequestered in the soil increases. But a very similar graph shows that the total productivity on the acres also increases. And the reason for this, it's probably not rocket science. That is, as you increase genetic diversity on a piece of land, the pest and pathogen pressure decreases. And in some cases, the ability to mobilize certain mineral nutrients increases. So certainly one of our goals is to try and move towards using such mixtures. Additionally, as I mentioned, corn and soybeans, which currently dominate agriculture in America and several other regions of the world, actually lead to quite a lot of soil loss, and it's one of the reasons that modern agriculture gets such a bad rap. You can see this is in tons per hectare per year of soil loss under corn and soybeans. By contrast, these perennial herbaceous plants like Miscanthus and switchgrass you can't measure soil loss from them. And so in the context of sustainability, we consider it vastly preferable. Now, additionally, the expectation is that with these perennial crops, they have a growth habit that has a very useful feature, and that is the following, that the perennial grasses in particular, they have a root that stays alive in the ground over winter. And at the end of the season, before the frost kills them, they undergo programmed cell death in which they mobilize mineral nutrients from the vegetative part of the plant into the root. So they store the phosphorus and nitrogen in the root over winter. So these plants are, at least in Europe, and I expect the same will be true here, are cut in the winter. So when you cut in this case, Miscanthus, you're mostly only removing carbon, and the mineral nutrients recycle each year, so that the expectation is that these will not require large inputs of mineral nutrients in order to maintain productivity. I should just mention on that point that if indeed we end up using such plants for fuels, any mineral nutrients that are removed and processed are available at the end of the process and would be returned to the land. That's currently the practice with sugarcane, and I expect it to be the same with these plants. Finally, in Europe, where the effect of growing stands of Miscanthus on biodiversity has been measured, they found that certainly compared to corn, these perennial species have a lot more biodiversity in the fields. And the reason is essentially that because these plants are not harvested until winter, the organisms that live in the stands complete their life cycles and aren't disrupted by the harvesting or spraying. Now, as to where these plants can be grown, in general, that's under study. We don't have a complete analysis of it. However, there is a model, a so-called crop model, a computational model that models how different species respond to heat and light and water and temperature. And when that model has been applied to Miscanthus in the state of Illinois, it actually appears that the region where Miscanthus is most productive is actually a different region than corn and soybeans. So we're not sure, but it could be that Miscanthus or crops like Miscanthus, perennial grasses, will be grown out of the Midwest. Indeed, the main limitation to plant productivity is water, well, heat and water. And so if we look at the United States as to where water is available, this is a rain map of the United States, you can see that it's pretty much east and south of the Mississippi. So this seems to be the region where there's some potential to develop dedicated bioenergy crops. We don't envision that these crops will be irrigated, although obviously no one can control that. But since water tables are declining around the world, it seems likely that we're going to have to rely on rainfall to produce the water to grow crops. To give you some sense of how much water is required, it depends what plant one is talking about, but in general, a plant like Miscanthus, a so-called C4 grass, will produce 1 gram of dry biomass for 250 grams of water. Whereas a plant like a tree, poplar or wheat, which is not a C4 grass, will generally require about 700 grams of water to make 1 gram of biomass. So one of the reasons we favor C4 grasses is that they are by far the most efficient users of water. And in some way, that's why we're focused on the C4 grasses right now. It may be that there are certain terrains where the C4 grasses won't grow, that is rocky or mountainous terrain, and it may well be that at some point in the future some woody species may be used, but right now that's not anticipated. This is what the water availability and heat looks like on a global scale. What one can see is that wherever it's red, it's basically too dry to have sustainable agriculture or large-scale agriculture. Wherever it's blue, it's too cold. So you can see there's a lot of opportunity in Eastern Europe. Indeed, the Russians are saying they also can produce 1 billion dry tons a year of biomass. And Europe is also calculated that, particularly in the East, they can produce 1 billion dry tons. There are several other regions of the world where we expect that to be the case. So those are the places where, if this is going to become a reality, in fact, China has quite a lot of potential as well. those are the regions where it's likely to take place. I want to turn now to what the challenge is with converting plants to fuels. So what I've tried to convey so far is what I at least think is going to happen in terms of the plants that are used. That is, I think we're going to start moving towards perennial C4 grasses that are grown specifically as energy crops, and then using the mass of those plants, and that in fact they eventually will start to displace some of the corn. Indeed, my colleague Steve Long at the University of Illinois has calculated that, well, this year on the acres that are grown for corn ethanol in the United States, those acres will only produce about 3% of our nation's fuel needs. Steve has calculated that if we grew Miscanthus on those same acres and could get the theoretical yield, we would get 20% of the nation's energy needs, transportation fuel needs, just from the acres that are grown this year for corn ethanol. So that gives you some sense of what the scale of it is. Well, let's turn now to how it is that one can convert cellulose to fuels. Basically, you grind it up. Typically, material is boiled in dilute acid. That kind of opens it up, and then some sugars are released by that, and those can be fermented directly to ethanol. The remaining solids are then treated with enzymes, cellulases. Those release additional sugars. Those are fermented and also converted to ethanol, and then the ethanol is usually distilled. So this process is it doesn't really show it, but there's quite a bit of heat and electricity goes into that. So critics of the technology, such as Dr. Patzek here at Berkeley, have made the following calculation and criticism, which is quite interesting. So they, from a recent paper, Patzek and Pimentel note that if you grow and burn switchgrass, it yields 15-fold more energy than it requires to produce it. I think that's very helpful in terms of understanding the issue. So it's not the growing and processing of plants that they're complaining about. However, they go on to say that if you convert switchgrass to ethanol, they calculate it would use 45% more energy than you would get back from the ethanol. Now that number is contested by people like Dan Kamen, who's also here at Berkeley. And in general, people believe, well, Dan's analysis would suggest that in fact you get much more energy back than is used in that conversion. But I think in general the criticism has some merit in that right now it's not a good process. And that in fact is where the research objective really is to say, can we get rid of the steam and electricity that are required for that conversion? So it's kind of an engineering challenge at that level. And I'd just like to briefly talk about what it means in a scientific context. So if we look at plant biomass, here's a section through a board, and all the mass is in the so-called cell walls, the red parts you can see. And if you look up close in a scanning electron micrograph, you see that the cell walls are actually composed of this network of overlapping fibers, which are actually composed of chains of glucose that are hydrogen bonded together to produce fibers that are very, very long, 15 microns long and about 3 to 5 nanometers in diameter. So this material is actually very insoluble and quite resistant to degradation. Additionally, that material is actually, I've tried to sort of represent it in this cartoon, that material is itself covered in another polysaccharide, generally a polymer of xylose, and that in turn is enclosed somehow in this polyphenolic compound called lignin, which is generally about a third or a quarter of the mass. So this is what biomass really looks like at the nanoscale. And one of the problem with it in some way is that the lignin seems to occlude access to the substrate of enzymes and other catalysts. So when you're boiling it in hot acid, in a way, what you're doing is actually sort of partially hydrolyzing the hemicellulose polymers to open it up so that enzymes can access it. Now, so in theory, what we'd really like to be able to do is just get rid of the lignin. But quite a lot is known about how lignin is made. This is the pathway, and I'm not actually going to walk you through it, but I'd want to say that quite a lot is known, and quite a lot of experiments have been done in which, in fact, even in some in my lab, in which mutants have been made in which we've knocked out various genes in the pathway. And what we've learned from that is that we can't just get rid of it because it provides compressive resistance to the body of the plants. And so that's not really an option for us. So we're going to need to find catalysts that can break it down. So an area that's probably kind of right now in some way at the center of research on that problem is using new capacity and high throughput DNA sequencing to explore natural systems to find enzymes that do it normally. And so, for example, termites process wood, lignocellulosic material, and the contents in the gut of these termites, or one of the guts, they have about 100 species of bacteria that actually secrete the enzymes that break down the lignocellulosic material. And those have just been sequenced from a wood digesting termite by the Joint Genome Institute in Walnut Creek here, part of the lab. Additionally, there's many other types of termites, so additional work is now continuing with termites that process grass and dung piles and various things. But the rumen of cattle is also a wonderful source. The average cow, I think, processes about 50 to 75 pounds a day of hay. And it also has about 100 species of microorganisms in the rumen that secrete the enzymes that carry out this process. And they're now available to us as well. There's both technologies for culturing them as well as for sequencing all their genes to identify the enzymes. Finally, we think that there's a good opportunity that's never been explored to develop synthetic catalysts to actually hydrolyze polysaccharides. It's just an area that has not attracted chemists up to now, and there's a group of young chemists here at Berkeley that are interested in taking on that challenge. In general terms, at the molecular level, it's a challenging problem because cellulose, which is shown here in a kind of a molecular simulation, is highly hydrogen bonded and insoluble. And when you try to model how an enzyme interacts with it, you have to posit that somehow the enzyme is able to abstract a strand of glucan from the substrate, which is actually seems kind of unlikely. Additionally, there's new solvents available that need to be explored. For example, I don't know if you can see it here, but this is a type of material called an ionic liquid that has the capability of dissolving cellulose. So you can see this is a micrograph of cellulose microfibrils. I think this is an atomic force micrograph. And after treatment with the ionic liquid, you can see how amorphous it's become because the ionic liquid has dissolved the hydrogen bonds that held the structure together. And this material is now much more available for hydrolysis. So we think that there's, and to make a long story short, a number of new initiatives, both on the biological side and on the chemical and chemical engineering side, that may allow us to process the biomass with much less energy input than current technology. Another very important thing we need to solve, or aspect of it that we need to solve, is shown here. So here's the composition in some crude way of a typical grass, and you can see that cellulose and hemicellulose both need to be utilized in order to make efficient use of it. Of course, lignin needs to be utilized as well. The hemicellulose is generally composed of xylose, which the current species of yeast that ferment sugars don't utilize, although microorganisms that utilize it are known, but the current ones don't. So one of the things we need to do is develop improved varieties of microorganisms that can ferment all the sugars to produce, in this case, ethanol, but perhaps other fuels. And this slide from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, shows what the impact of using all the sugars is. So for example, their calculus is that if one ferments glucose only, the cost is around $2.40 a gallon, whereas if you can use 85% of the xylose, it drops to $1.33 a gallon. Now that looks very manageable to me, but and it just requires, I think, an infusion of research. Finally, a really important opportunity is that right now is that all the focus is on ethanol. And the reason the focus is on ethanol is that we had some 5,000-year-old technology for making ethanol on a pretty large scale, and no innovation was required to start using it. However, from first principles, ethanol is not what we would choose as a biofuel. What we really want is diesel and gasoline, or something a lot like them. So it turns out that actually many microorganisms make compounds that are a lot more similar to diesel and gasoline. And the chemistry is interesting. It's all organisms make these kind of compounds. This is a carbon, fully saturated fatty acid, and many organisms, in fact every plant, has enzymes that will remove the carboxylic acid function to produce an alkane, an N-alkane, actually the principal component of both gasoline and diesel fuel. So we see some really interesting biological opportunities to develop new microorganisms that will secrete fuels that will displace ultimately ethanol. And we think that's very important because we have 240 million vehicles in the US alone, and only about 5 million of those will burn more than 10% ethanol. Additionally, of course, we don't have a distribution network for ethanol. So if we're going to really try and meet the Secretary's goal of 30% of our fuels from biosources, we're either going to have to replace the fleet and the distribution network or make a much better fuel that's compatible with the current system. And I'm betting that we can actually make something that's compatible with the existing system. Indeed, in addition to the biological routes, there's also some new chemistry that we want to explore. George Huber and colleagues published recently a paper in which they showed conversion of sugars directly to alkanes by novel catalysts. Of course, this is George, in this particular transformation, was using hydrogen from the biomass itself, but I think that we may see something like this transformation, but using hydrogen from another source. That is, until a couple of years ago, there was quite a lot of talk about the hydrogen economy, and that seems to somehow have slipped away because perhaps of the challenges of storing and distributing hydrogen in part. However, the nation has a really quite high capacity to produce hydrogen under certain circumstances, and that is, it's possible, for example, if you take coal or petrol or oil, to heat it at high temperature into a gas, and in the presence of water vapor, the hydrogen will separate from the carbon, and those streams of gases can be split. So that if you can dispose of the CO2 in a way that doesn't cause climate change, such as shown here, you can use the hydrogen directly to drive turbines, or, in theory, we could use it to reduce polysaccharides to produce alkanes. And in fact, that would, in that sense, the biomass, the polysaccharides would become a carrier for hydrogen, and it actually would make a much better use of the biomass. So I actually think it possible that we may see something like carbon sequestration and biomass joining up and to create sort of hybrid fuels. Now, this is far from my area of expertise, but I do just want to mention that there already is quite a lot of this carbon sequestration going on. Oil companies use it to, supercritical CO2 is an excellent solvent for oil, and so they've been pumping it into oil wells to push the oil towards extractive methods. In addition, there's a number of sites around the world now where CO2 is being pumped in quite large amounts into saline aquifers. This is the most famous site, the so-called Sleipner site in the North Sea, where there's an aquifer at 1,000 meters, a saline aquifer, and they're putting 1 million tons a year of CO2 into it. The first 3 sites for saline sequestration have just been identified in the US, as far as I can understand it, and so experiments will begin here as well. And the calculations about the Sleipner site, by the way, are that the claim is that that single site could take the total CO2 emissions of Europe, based on some studies of what's possible there. So, I think this is an area to watch, and actually I'm pretty sure, I believe this is going to come along as concern about CO2 increases. So I'd like to then summarize what I've sort of tried to convey. In the context of the research priorities, which is mostly what I'm personally involved in, there's 4 main priorities. That is, developing energy crops and the associated agronomic practices, getting better catalysts to convert the biomass into something we can use to make fuels, getting better microorganisms that will use all the sugars, and developing new types of microorganisms that produce and secrete hydrophobic compounds like diesel and petrol. And those goals actually come from a Department of Energy study and involving quite a large number of scientists. So indeed, those goals are largely the goals that we adopted when we founded the Energy Biosciences Institute here. And fortunately, In fact, I hope it's known that we actually have developed two bioenergy institutes at Berkeley. There's one supported by a grant from the Department of Energy called the Joint Bioenergy Institute. And of course, the Energy Biosciences Institute is supported by BP, involves Berkeley, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and LBL. And the goals are actually quite broad. It's to eliminate bottlenecks to biofuels, to make improved technologies for fuel production, education of scientists across the relevant disciplines. In order to implement this institute, what we did was that in the spring, when BP announced they were going to negotiate exclusively with Berkeley, we opened up a competition at the three academic organizations where we invited our colleagues to propose against the goals of a DOE study that fundamentally had the same four goals I mentioned earlier. And we received 250 proposals, and we estimate there were between 500 and 700 faculty members as authors of those proposals. We then subjected those proposals to an analysis by an academic committee composed of people from the three institutions to prioritize them only with regard to how well they addressed the goals of that we had put on the website. We then took 85 of the pre-proposals that addressed the goals and sent them out and invited full proposals, very much like an NSF proposal or something. When we received those, we sent them out for outside review outside the university, and then had 3 panels review them in the context of the written reviews. So we're almost at the end of that process, and we're hoping to, we expect to fund about 50 groups at the 3 academic organizations to pursue them. And in general, I thought it was interesting to show you in rough terms where the resources we expect to allocate them. So you can see we have a pretty big group in socioeconomics. We have some ecologists. This is breaking down the biomass, this is fermenting it, and this is producing the plants. And so that's how we pretty much expect to, the kind of what the program will look like. Now, it's known to us all that this has been controversial in some quarters and that some people are opposed to it. It's understandable. I just thought you might find it interesting to see why it's necessary or why it's useful to consider a relationship with a company. This is the federal research budget, and unfortunately it only goes to 2003, but one thing really stands out, and that is this is actually not of course the defense budget, that's just the defense research budget. And down here is the energy budget. Here's Jimmy Carter's era. And so, you know, that's one reason why we're looking around for other sources. That's one reason why 250 groups of faculty were interested in applying for the money. It's because actually the money to address these problems is not readily available from the government. If one looks at the research budget of the US in a different way, here it is again over here. So defense is about defense research, 65 billion. One might consider NASA to be research as well. And in fact, the research for all plant biology, all agriculture, all forestry, all plant biology, that's how much it is. It doesn't show above the line barely. So that's one of the reasons we're enthusiastic about this opportunity. Of course, I would say the other reason is that if one really wants to have an effect, that is, our goal is to try and provide, you know, a partial, at least, solution to a major problem. I don't think academics cannot do that without having a relationship with the people who actually provide the goods and services. And so, from my perspective, it's very useful to be able to talk directly to one of the largest energy companies in the world in a very honest and frank way. And indeed, the only thing we've really promised BP is that we will give them a complete analysis of the opportunity. We're going to look in all the dark places. We're going to try and understand what the opportunity really is, all the way from sociological effects in the third world to you know, novel catalysts. I think that's something that universities are uniquely qualified to do, and in fact, in that respect, I think this relationship, this emerging relationship, is an entirely appropriate activity to be at a university. At that, I'll stop, and I just want to say that much of what I talked about is present in a a study that's available online, a book that you can get online from the Department of Energy. And well, this is what we hope at least part of the future will look like. I hope we can move towards a renewable world, and I see the research that we're trying to get going here at Berkeley as feeding that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. We invite your questions, and there are microphones on both the right and left, and if we could alternate with questions, that would help us. Will you activate the mics? Thank you. I'll go down and... Do you want to handle just calling alternate?
Sure.
Well, the microphone doesn't seem to be on, but I think you can probably hear me. So it seems, oh, there it is. It seems like there are two, you have to sort of ask, what problem are you trying to solve? It could be that there's a real shortage of fuel, or it could be that there's so much fuel that we're going to have a big carbon dioxide crisis. Now, the way you deal with the plants is very different depending upon which is the real problem. Now, I think the carbon dioxide is the real problem. That suggests to me we don't really have a shortage of fuel. What we really need to do is to have a way to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that would say that instead of fermenting the plants, you would just bury them in the ground. And what do you say about that?
Yeah, you know, that has been suggested. It's not, you know, in terms, it's not a terrible idea, to be honest. You know, grind them up and pump them into some deep place in the ground.
Actually, it's already been tried. It's the Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island, which takes all the pulp and paper that produces the Sunday New York Times that nobody ever reads, and dumps them in this giant landfill that's 500 feet high on Staten Island. But it's a way of sequestering carbon.
Yes, and in fact, BP, I didn't really dwell on it, but BP asked us to examine biosequestration as one of the goals of the Institute. So we just finished convening a workshop here at Berkeley on biosequestration to try and understand what the residence time and the turnover time of materials under different storage regimes is. So it might be something that's actually done, yeah. We need to keep it out of the atmosphere, obviously, for quite a long time, that's all. Yes?
I don't know if you or me start time. I think this is brilliant, and I'd like to put a context on it and ask a question. My name is Sam Fleming. I sit on the current task force of the Defense Science Board on energy strategy for DOD that you may know about. Stan Bull and others are on it. Bobby Garrett and the U.S. Department of Defense is the #1 user of transportation fuels in the United States, about 1% of total. 70% of that is biodiesel, is diesel fuel for aircraft and battle tanks. Gasohol doesn't do it. So the exciting thrust you have here, directed to biodiesel, is very important. And I'm struck by the research dollars from DOD on the one hand, and the bar here is penultimate chart, and what's going into the agricultural research and other. Clearly a proposition, and I know that Steve Chu has been before Congress on ARPA-E. Clearly a prospect would be to redirect some of that DOD defense in this direction because it's DOD's best interest to do that. So a DARPA-like approach has got a lot of merit, and I will solicit your support in marshaling this argument to put it before the Defense Science Board in the current report, which goes to the Secretary of Defense.
Yes,
I made a similar argument to Sam Bodman.
I totally agree with what you said, and in fact, as you probably know, the former director of the CIA goes around the country pointing out that, you know, dealing with this issue is a strategic issue, and it shouldn't be really separated. Of course, I think in fairness, you know, oil was trading at $13 a barrel 9 years ago, and so even though, you know, so things have happened rather rapidly, and I think the whole system is undergoing an adjustment in a very interesting way. So we do see some signs of progress in the, you know, the federal government's response to it, I think.
And Pacheco, formerly Vanderbilt, now departed, has made exactly that brief on the progress with regard to algae 13 years ago in reinvigoration. But adding this perspective, I think, is a wonderful thing.
Thank you. Yes, I'm on a committee called the Committee for America's Energy Future that's a National Research Council committee and convened by or requested by the Congress. And this is a comprehensive committee that has a nuclear subcommittee, an electricity subcommittee, and a bio subcommittee, and several others. So our goal we're on so-called fast track, and our goal will be by next summer to produce a definitive report that the Congress can use to get validated numbers for what's possible with the various options. Yes?
I just have a simple question. Do you have any kind of categorization of fuels? The use of the word fuel seems to encompass a lot of different kinds of chemicals or different kinds of products, and which one is to be used and which one is not to be used, or at what point, or how you choose which one to use is a little bit complex for people who do not follow it. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, I'm intentionally obscure about exactly which fuel because I would consider it emerging technology. So right now we would like to know what can we produce. And there's, as you may know, there's many equivalently good fuels. In general, we're talking about highly reduced hydrocarbons, preferably a branched hydrocarbon. And whatever it is that's actually produced if it's produced biologically, my expectation is it may be reformed by traditional petroleum cracking into something that looks a lot more like the final product. So right now, I think we're focused on just understanding what we can produce. And then generally break down into most of the focus right now is on alkanes, linear alkanes, and on isoprenoids or terpenoids.
Yes, I was wondering if you actually looked at this movie put out by many different scientists on looking at the solar atmosphere and the cosmic atmosphere determining the climate on Earth. It's called the Great Global Warming Swindle. Mm-hmm. And I put this forward because, I mean, we are facing a great economic crisis right now. Food shortages is a major problem on this planet. Water shortages is another one, right? And at the same time, you have a push from the neocons, Dick Cheney, for World War III, right? So what is really the underlying intent behind using food in this crisis we face, this strategic crisis also, for fuel?
My goal is to not use food. Everything I spoke about was to not use food.
You're using water. That could be used for food instead.
Well, that's not the limitation to food availability worldwide. Indeed, you know, an interesting aspect of this issue is I think it's a legitimate question to what extent production of biofuels may cause food shortages. So I don't know the answer to that, but many NGOs have been saying for years that one of the problems with food security around the world is that the developed world currently spends about $100 billion a year subsidizing agriculture, and then that leads to overproduction and dumping of food elsewhere in the world, and that in turn suppresses regional economic or agricultural economies. So World Watch indeed has made an analysis of this and is generally supportive of that position. So I don't know the answer to it, but we have some really excellent economists at Berkeley that are engaged in this problem, and we're going to try and see through it. None of us want to do anything that's likely to create hardship elsewhere in the world. It's a very tricky problem because of, as people will know, there's a lack of social equity in many regions of the world, and you could have wealthy elites using the land and water resources to produce things that are sold on the open market instead of feeding their people, and none of us want to support that. I think seeing the problem will be, and validating that problem will allow us to propose rational policy to prevent those things from happening. Right now, that's the best we can do, I think. you know, biofuels is not hypothetical. This year, I believe the total production will be above 15 billion gallons, all coming from food. So I think it's really incumbent on us to try and really understand this on a world scale and see to what extent it can be modified or improved. For example, just using the cellulose from sugarcane looks to me like an improvement over only using the sugar. Yes.
I'm on the Hardwood Task Force Blue Ribbon Committee from the Department of Agriculture in Pennsylvania. I just moved here about a year ago. And in our study for use of low-value, low-quality hardwoods, we came up with some yields indicating that just in Pennsylvania, with about 16 million forested acres, the potential for production was somewhere between, depending on technology and availability, between 200 to 800 million gallons per year of ethanol. And I noticed through all your presentation, you just briefly mentioned plantation forestry and pretty much probably populous. Why you don't really get involved in the use of forest biomass, where we have 580 million roughly acres in the U.S. versus 800 to 900 arable acres, kind of relating to the last question.
Yes, it's an excellent question. I didn't mean to, I don't really have anything against woody biomass, and I actually think it may be one of the places where we see the first large-scale plantations or large-scale facilities in the U.S., because a lot of the woody biomass is actually owned by large landowners who can consolidate very large amounts of acreage and make it available. And there's no particular problem. The reason that we prefer, you know, we're really focused on perennial grasses is the water use efficiency. So it's about three times lower than any tree. And so certainly on an acre where you can grow either a C4 grass or a tree, it should be a C4 grass in terms of just raw productivity. But in those regions where the terrain won't support, you know, C4 grasses, then I think it will be trees.
I was concerned about combustion of biofuels. What's known about the byproducts of combustion which can contribute to global warming? And if something's known about it, what's the sort of percent improvement versus burning a gallon of biofuel versus a gallon of gas, just so we have a sense of the proportion?
Yes, I apologize. It's a little bit outside my expertise. There has been a recent study published by one of my colleagues at Stanford pointing out that actually ethanol leads to use of ethanol in fuels, although his calculation was based on 85% ethanol, does lead to a slight increase in some aldehydes in the atmosphere. I think it was aldehydes, as I remember, and that was deleterious. Although he concludes his article, so it got a lot of press actually, but he concludes his article by saying, oh, but we can probably deal with that by putting modifying the emission controls on the car. So that's certainly an area of study. I think the biggest danger is, well, it's a complicated study, and I don't think I should comment. It's so far outside my expertise. But in general terms, it's not seen as an issue that's going to fundamentally change the acceptability of the fuels. But it might change the temperature at which engines, you know, the combustion of engines, and it might alter the emission controls that have to go on vehicles. If we actually end up making alkanes or something more like that, obviously I think some of those concerns about combustion also go away. So that is, if we can produce fuels that are directly chemically comparable to the fuels in use today.
Thank you for a great talk, and my question's a little off topic, but I think it's very relevant. And it has to do, my understanding is that a huge amount of greenhouse gases are caused by permanent fires in the coal mines in India and China. And what I've been actually in my mind recently is to try and find out other initiatives that are dealing with this. It seems like a major thing to prevent more greenhouse gases. A solution is possible, that we should be putting energy into this, you know.
I apologize, I don't know the answer to that. I'm also aware of that. We have begun, I would say that at least everything I'm involved with has a very strong biological component to it, and so I'm not involved in things that are sort of on the physics side of things. However, there are some notable sites around the world where there's a lot of emissions where there might be biological solutions. So we've begun a dialogue with the Alberta tar sands, where you may know there's a site up there that's probably become the largest point source of CO2 on the planet, because in the Alberta tar sands, which has reserves comparable to Saudi Arabia, they're melting it's a heavy oil that's in the sand, and so to remove it, to separate the sand and the oil, they heat it to decrease the viscosity by burning natural gas. And that leads to tremendous emissions. And so we're going to be exploring whether we might be able to find a solution in which we use detergents to wash the oil out of the sand or something like that might diminish those emissions. That's the closest I come to anything related.
Chris, do you have any closing remarks for us?
You know,
Fuel beyond effluent.
my closing remarks would be, I think that the world faces a really serious challenge, and I hope I didn't convey that. I didn't want to convey that biofuels are the solution. There's no solution. There's no single solution. There's no magic bullet. So we're looking for magic buckshot, is what I like to think, in which we need many solutions, and I'm in favor of all of the carbon neutral ones. And this is. I also want to say that although I was cast as being a proponent of biofuels, the only thing I'm a proponent of is trying to understand the opportunity. I think we don't know enough yet to know whether it's something we really want to do on a large scale, and I'm hoping that that's what research here at Berkeley can really uncover during the next years, and pretty much that's what our contract with BP is to tell them, should it be done or not, from every possible view. Well, thank you very much.